Well, what do you do when you've betrayed a friend? And how do you feel when you've failed the one you love the most? Is it possible to even look at such a person in the eyes again? A person that you've lied about, stood silent while others dragged him away in chains to prison, trial, and torture, and certain death. And so it was with Peter. His heart now stabbing within him, convulsing with hot tears flowing like streams running down his face. How do you feel when you've betrayed a friend? How do you feel when you've not just stumbled spiritually, but you've fallen from a great height into the black abyss and despair? Well, what do you do when you've betrayed a friend? And where do you go to get away from yourself? Well, you go home to a former life. Home to a place comfortable, where the human spirit falls into the grooved paths once familiar, an old life once secure. And so Peter says to himself and others, I go fishing. So filled with gut-wrenching pain, he does what so many do. He runs into the night, leading back to the place of familiar haunts, as if to erase his mind, his memories, even just for a few moments, as if to stop his mind from racing, if only to occupy his hands, to disengage his mind, and anything that numbs his pain. And what better place to run and hide than into the dark? But even the darkness of that night will not allow him to hide, for the glow of the full Passover moon floods the sky with light glinting on the lapping waves against the vessel, giving the whole atmosphere a dream-like quality. But even here, he cannot forget. And a thought whispers into the back of his mind. Peter, there is nowhere to hide. For wherever you will go, you take yourself with you. And yet, try as he might to forget, a tide of memories just flood his mind, beginning with some memories too wonderful for words. And an image now comes to his mind, a remembrance of 3 years ago, when Jesus not only healed his wife's mother, but the way he did it, without fanfare, without hysterics, he simply touched her with his loving hand. And instantly she was healed from this fever unto death. And she got about and began serving Jesus. Well, what else does he remember? He remembers a moment when Jesus commandeered his boat on that first day when he met him again in northern Galilee. And like a commander of a ship, he barks orders to the fishermen. And he says, launch out into deep waters. And there he gives the command, let go your nets. But they protest, we've fished all night and caught nothing. And yet, resisting, they decide to do it. And suddenly, the water boils, and they pull in a haul of nets that causes the vessel to list to the starboard side, almost threatening to sink the ship. And wading ashore, the fishermen haul in a miraculous catch. So much so that Peter says, get away from me, Lord. I'm not worthy to be in your presence. Another memories follow. The day when he and two other disciples followed Jesus, scaling to the heights of a snow-capped mountain, and having fallen asleep, they wake up to the chilled night and a sight of Jesus glowing like 1,000 suns in brightness, and by him two ethereal figures, Moses and Elijah. What a moment that must have been. Memories. And another memory follows when near the north border of Galilee, the demarcation line that separates Israel from the Gentile territories beyond, Jesus said to Peter, "Who do you say I am?" And stepping forth on behalf of all the disciples, he says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus encourages him, saying, "Yes, flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but the Father has revealed this to you." Well, other memories come to mind. Not just pleasant memories, but there are memories that he wishes that he could throw away forever. So now, crestfallen, his eyes go dark, and he reflects and wishes that he could erase forever some of these memories from his mind. And so his thoughts transport him back in time to a late night supper just 3 nights before, when all of his disciples were reclining together around a supper, a Passover supper. And Jesus made an unusual prophecy. He said, "You will all stumble over me and deny me this night." And Peter, boasting, an ill-fated boast, he said, "Others maybe, but I never." In which place Jesus rebukes him and says the famous words, "Before this night is out, Peter, you will deny me 3 times before the rooster crows." Now, shuttering his eyes and closing his thoughts, his heart shudders as he looks back to that moment. Inescapable, he tries to forget that memory, but he can't. Because that was the night he fell. And that was the night he failed. And later on that same night, when Jesus entered into great temptation at a garden called Gethsemane, Jesus had asked him and 2 other brothers, 2 other disciples, to stay with him there and pray, for he needed prayer. As Jesus entered into a night of torment and trial, and coming out of that horrid experience, he sees the disciples and Peter falling asleep, and Jesus wakes them and rebukes them. "Can't you even stay awake for 1 hour when I needed you most?" And in that futile attempt, he now stops his mind from racing, thinking back on that, and another memory confronts him. When after the arrest and Jesus is dragged away, he followed, but only from a distance. And so too was his loyalty at that moment, distant. And another memory flashes before his eyes. And the image of himself, almost as if from another point of view, he imagines himself sitting by that courtyard. The courtyard of the high priest, sitting at a fire, the enemy's fire, pretending to be one of them, as he listens in to the mock trial taking place close by. And now that Peter, resisting the temptation to hope against hope, to erase that memory, He can't repress it. Because that is the moment that he fell. He capitulated. And he failed. And he fell completely. Because this once fearless sailor is now cowed by a wisp of a girl who says, "Aren't you one of those who are with Jesus?" To which Peter replies flatly, "Woman, I don't know him." And then another one from the crowd says boldly, "You are one of them." And Peter responds, "I am not." And then the same, "He is one of them. Just listen to his Galilean accent." But again, vehemently, he denies it. And this time with crass swearing and cursing. And while still speaking, he sees Jesus looking at him. And no words are spoken. No words are necessary. And no words are possible. And at that very moment, the distant sound of a rooster echoing through the streets. And he remembers the prophecy, "Before this night you will deny me 3 times, Peter, before the rooster crows." And it was then that his heart sank to utter and total despair. Peter fell. He fell as if stepping over the edge of some cliff, plummeting down into what seemed like an eternity, into a black pit of sadness, guilt, and worse, shame. And so, fleeing for his life, he runs from the face of God. Peter, the fugitive, goes into hiding. Peter could not bear to go to the cross that day, let alone draw near to the cross. And let alone could he ever look into the face of Jesus or look into his eyes ever again. Or so he thought. Then something wonderful happens. On the morning of the 3rd day, Jesus rises from the dead, and Peter awakens to the news, good news, the best news. Mary Magdalene, out of breath, having just run from the garden tomb, brings the message, Jesus is alive. Dead 3 days, now living. And later that evening, behind closed doors, Peter and the other disciples see Jesus, risen from the dead, and Jesus holding out his arms like this, not only to show his nail-pierced hands, but also to figuratively welcome them like a father would put his hands out to a little child. And then a week later, he appears to them again in the same upper room, this time Thomas now present. Now, how could Peter have more joy in his heart? And yet at the same time, his joy is mixed with remorse. He's saying in his heart, how can I face him? What will he say to me when we speak one another alone? And what must he be thinking of me after all I've done, betraying him 3 times, and me supposed to be the head of the disciples? And something else. How can I ever be worthy again to be a disciple? Is all truly forgiven? And even if it is, how can I ever forgive myself? And still thinking to himself, Peter wonders, as he's alone, and when will he ever speak Jesus to Jesus one-on-one? And if he does, surely I can never look into his all-knowing eyes, his piercing eyes that looks into the depths of my soul. So what do you do when you've betrayed a friend? And how do you feel when you've failed the one you love the most? And where do you go? You go home to the place of your old haunts, a place once comfortable, a place where the human spirit falls into the grooved paths once familiar. And so Peter says that night to himself, I'm going fishing. I'm going home. As if for just a few minutes I can forget. For instance, if just for a few minutes I can stop my mind from racing, if only to occupy my hands and disengage the mind, to numb the pain and the guilt. And so, having finished that night fishing without a single nibble, a voice echoes across the water from the distant shore, from a man unrecognizable, but a silhouette against the pre-dawn sky. And the voice calls to him, "Let down your nets." And doing so, a great haul of fish comes and nearly sinks the vessel. And suddenly there's a moment of recognition. Peter remembers another day, another day's fishing, same place, same boat, same miraculous catch, same voice from afar. It's then that Peter puts on his clothes and then dives into the water. We always do the opposite, don't we? But he puts his clothes on and dives into the water. And he comes up on the shore, perhaps looking more like a half-drowned cat coming to its master. And there he discovers in the sand a wood fire and fish upon it. Still in the pre-dawn darkness. And instantly, with stabbing guilt, he remembers another fire not that long ago, where 3 times he denied him. And here, this time, 3 times Jesus asks him now, "Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you still? Peter, do you?" And 3 times Peter bows his head, ashamed to look into the master's eyes. And his heart is heavy. And with each question he replies, "Yes, you know I love you. You know I do. You know, Lord." And with each of Peter's responses, Jesus affirms him 3 times. "Feed my lambs. Tend my sheep. Feed my sheep." It's then that Peter understands. And like the dawn breaking over the hills, the light of God just floods his soul. And his eyes now meet those of Jesus. And finally, it's all made clear. "Yes, I am forgiven," he says to himself. "Yes, all my sin is forgotten. And yes, my soul is renewed. And my place amongst the disciples is reestablished. And my ministry restored." And with these thoughts, tear glistened on his cheeks and flow down. Jesus still wants him. My people and my friends, if you haven't got it yet, the story is about Jesus, but more, it's about you and me. Because Jesus still wants you. And no matter what you've done, and no matter who you are, Jesus still loves you, and there's no weight of shame too heavy that he cannot lift, and there's no stain upon your soul that he's unable to cleanse, and there's no sin he's unwilling to forgive. And so, like Peter, if you too have fallen, it need not be forever.